Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for putting your thoughts together. And again, if you can send me those through your email, I would really appreciate it. And Dan and I will compile all of them, and that will help influence the strategic planning process. If you would have somebody at your table add to the chat one or two of your ideas, that would be great. And so we will read those out loud. If you can get somebody to type into our chat, I will stall right now by showing you another video. And so you can have a few seconds to type your ideas into that chat. Button. Welcome back. I will put the two ideas that we had in our table. I see lots of great ideas flowing in. Okay. All right, great. Thank you so much. Oh, such great ideas. So we've got co-producing events. Oh, Meredith put in a whole list. Thank you so much. World's largest yard sale along the whole riverway. Similar to the river cleanup. Progressive dinner, amateur photography contest, artist swap. Such great ideas. So thank you for putting those in. So in the chat, and I'm going to welcome Dan Foley back to the stage. So Dan, turn your camera on.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for those great ideas. That's, as we pointed out, we're going to really look at those and try to make sure that we implement ones that really that can work to help bring communities together. I wanted to, before I introduce Brad Beaubien, who's going to be our speaker today, I wanted to talk about one initiative that we're going to be launching at the end of the month. As I mentioned before, one of our kind of 3 draft priorities that our strategic planning group has been working on is the need to build more investment in riverfront development projects, both in the river. Again, things like making sure we fill in the gaps on the bike path, making sure we support more public spaces and parks, but also in river communities. All of the communities along the Great Miami have been working on master plans where they're working to connect the river to the town, whether it's Sydney or Middletown or Dayton or Hamilton, and every one of them. And there's incredible opportunities for investment. As we mentioned last week, we've seen over $100 million invested in public spaces and parks over the last few decades. Millions more have been invested, millions more private sector dollars have been invested in our communities. And the two go hand in hand. And again, all of our communities have plans on the books to drive more investment, whether it's in the river or whether it's in the community themselves. And I mentioned this last week, but I mean, there's 250,000 rivers in the country, and I believe that there's not any or many that have 10 thriving, distinct, authentic communities like we have on the river, and that's really our competitive advantage, is to drive that investment. On October 27th, we're going to launch a new webinar that we're going to work to try to do every month, and they're free, that focuses on economic investment opportunities of the river, of the riverway. We'll highlight investments that have been made, and also investments that our communities are pursuing as we push toward a more thriving riverway in our 10 communities. The first webinar, again, is scheduled for Wednesday, October 27th, and I'm going to be interviewing the Canadian Consul General, Joe Cromartin. He's going to be our first guest. He's going to talk about increased trade opportunities for riverway communities because in Canada, and you might think, why are we doing that? Well, all of our riverway communities have one thing in common. They've got a river on one side and they've got I-75 access on the other side. And in Canada, there's a brand new bridge that's being built between Ontario and Detroit. It's a 6-lane, almost $6 billion bridge that's going to connect Canada to our I-75 communities. The reason that matters is that according to the Canadian Trade Office, Canada is Ohio's #1 customer. Ohio sells more goods to Canada than to our next 8 largest foreign markets combined. So this physical bridge, this bricks and mortar project, represents an opportunity for Sydney all the way to Hamilton to, I think, to be aware of those opportunities and to try to build some strategies around, taking advantage of that. You're going to hear the Consul General talk about an initiative that they want to pursue to really kind of connect themselves to communities along I-75. And so I think this is an opportunity to bring some knowledge to all of our communities that maybe they hadn't known as much about before. And I just want to say I'm very grateful. The Dayton Development Coalition, who is part of Jobs Ohio, is going to partner with us on that October 27th call. The Dayton Development Coalition has 12 counties that they represent in everywhere from Sydney all the way down to southern Ohio, including Dayton. And we're grateful that they're going to really help us kind of push this out and help us. So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. And every month, I'm going to be looking for, Sarah and I are going to be looking for different economic trends, different opportunities that communities are working hard on. And so you'll receive your invitation to join us through our electronic newsletter. And please share that if you can. If you think for this October 27th interview that I'll be doing, if you think there's anybody who might be interested about this this bridge, it's not going to be built, I think, until 2000. It won't be done being built until 2024. So we have a time to really kind of share this knowledge. So thanks. All right, I think now I get the distinct. Oh yeah, yep.
Wait, just 2 things. Ron, I think, had his hand up.
Okay.
Ron, if you have a question, you can type it into chat and we'll make sure it gets answered. I'm keeping an eye on chat. I know Mallory is also keeping an eye on chat. So if you have anything that you'd like us to ask, if you purposely raised your hand, put that in the chat. Also, I put some questions that the speaker would like to ask you in the Q&A. So go over to the right hand of your screen and click on Q&A and vote for the things that you have done or the questions that he is asking you about Indianapolis. So our speaker, Brad, would like to know a little bit about your experience with Indy. And so make sure you get on over there in the next 30 seconds and vote for those 4 questions. I have been to all of them because my father and my grandparents are from Indy. I worked there for 3 years, so I get to say yes to all those. Okay, I'm going to pop off.
By the way, Brad, I attended the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the Indy 500. It got rained out, but I never understood how big that place was. It was amazing. It was fun. And so again, I get Sarah, thank you for that. I get the distinct privilege of introducing Brad Beaubien, who's our speaker today. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about who Brad Beaubien is. Brad, by the way, Brad was supposed to join us in April at our in-person event at the Fitness Center in Hamilton. And I want to thank again Mallory Greenham and Jacob from the city. They've been really great. We are going to, knock on wood, we're going to be doing that in person next April. So watch out for those announcements. But we're grateful to the City of Hamilton. They put a lot of work on this. And we're grateful to Brad for hanging in there with us and doing this talk today. So Brad Beaubien is an award-winning certified urban planner who serves as the Director of Destination Development for Visit Indy, a destination marketing organization that's working to enhance the quality of life in Indianapolis by really focusing on visitor-related economic impact, which is really right up our alley as in our work with the Riverway. In his role, he works to implement planning investments that make the city an attractive place to live, because a great place to live is also a great place to visit. Previously, he served as the administrator for long-range city planning for the city of Indianapolis, where he was responsible for leading all long-range planning functions of the city-county government, and was the lead planner and project director for the White River Vision Plan, which we'll hear all about today. Brad holds an undergraduate degree in urban planning from Ball State University, as well as graduate degrees in urban planning and natural resources from Ball State University and Oregon State University. So we are very grateful today to welcome Brad Beaubien. And Brad, welcome to the Great Miami Riverway.
All right, thank you, Dan, and thank you all for joining me today. I really wish I could have seen you in person this spring, but here we are. So let me get my screen shared here. All right, there we go. And so it is really an honor to be here, because I think in some ways that you'll see through this presentation, we have viewed both the Conservancy District as well as the Riverway concept as a role model for what we're trying to do. And so I'm really quite humbled to be asked to be here today to share what we've been working on for the past 3 years or so. And so I've got a ton of content that I really hope to get through. I'm going to give you a super quick intro and some history lesson on kind of Indy's relationship with our river, and really focus more recently on how our community has really come to focus on this opportunity. Then I'll do a deep dive into our vision plan process, its recommendations, and some of our early wins. And then I'll really wrap up with where we're at today, trying to set up a regional entity for implementation and stewardship. And so by the time I'm done with all this, I hope that you can answer these 3 questions. So how Indy came to focus on the river, what's covered by the vision plan itself, and then what our next steps are as far as implementation. And so as far as setting the stage, I just briefly kind of give you some comparisons, or just introduce you to where the White River is and kind of how large it is. And so it actually starts up close to the Ohio River border. And so those of you in Dayton are actually closer to the source of the White River than I am here in Indy. It flows about 312 miles before it connects with the east fork of the river. And then it flows another 50 miles before it hits the Wabash River, which then, of course, turns into the Ohio River. So in total, the system drains about 5,700 square miles of land. And these photos here are the source of the river, which is in a farm field in rural Randolph County, literally in the middle of a farm field. It's primarily groundwater fed. There's a high water table there. And then it flows, like I said, through Indianapolis. Now, you mentioned, 10 distinct authentic communities or so along the Great Miami. We really only have 4 large communities. There's lots of communities of a couple hundred to a couple thousand, but there's really only 4 communities: Indianapolis, and then there's 3 kind of county seats upstream. And so as far as our relationship through history to the river, we have a really similar settlement history to Ohio. You take everything that you guys did over there and delay it by 20 years, and you get our story. But prior to the European settlement, the Miami tribe and the Delaware peoples really called this area home along the banks of the Wapahani, which is what their word for white sands. That's their name for the river. In 1816, Indiana became a state and promptly set out to build a new state capital in the center of the state. We were really big. Actually, Indiana was quite exceptional at draining wetlands for the first 150 years of our history. And so apparently we really liked how DC was laid out in a swamp. And so we hired a student of Pierre L'Enfant, who laid out Washington, DC, a guy named Alexander Ralston, to find a good swamp in the middle of the city, or in the middle of the state, and laid out Indianapolis. And so this is the original plat map. If you've been to Indy, you know Monument Circle, that is the heart of our city. And so this map just shows you the original plat for the city, which was a mile square, and how close it was to the river. And so we were platted in 1821, and really into the 1940s, we grew very slowly. The White River was not really a navigable waterway. And so all the goods and things to grow our city really had to been being brought in on wagons and kind of overland. But in 1847, the railroads arrived, and we really started to become an industrialized city. So many factories were encouraged or required to be located on the river. And we actually had a local law that they had to dump their waste into the river. This was before we had a sewer system. So that was our early relationship with the river. It was a fantastic way to dispose of waste. And so by the 1880s, the river was literally a dumping ground for industrial waste, for slaughterhouses, for everything along the river. And also, as our sewer system was constructed, after that time, it was a single system, like many cities. So our storm sewer and our sanitary sewer go into the same combined system. And when it was designed, over a century ago, it was designed so that if and when it overflowed, it would overflow into the White River, again, because it's a fantastic way to get rid of waste, right? Now, during these early years, there were two significant things that helped us preserve some of our land along the river. The first was a series of plans starting in 1909 by a landscape architect named George Kessler, which was really the first city plan since our 1820 plat. And so he had done something a year earlier in your neck of the woods in Cincinnati, but he used the city streams and a network of boulevards to connect parks together. And so as the city grew, this allowed our streams really to be preserved as public corridors. And then there were the floods of March 1913, which gave birth to the Miami Conservancy as well. They wreaked havoc along the White River. We did not approach it in a regional way as far as our response, unlike you all did with the creation of the Conservancy District. But each of our communities did construct a series of flood wall and levee systems, which simultaneously really preserved those public corridors, but they also disconnected a lot of public access from the river. And so getting into the modern era, White River State Park was established as a redevelopment area in 1979, but the first attraction, the Indianapolis Zoo downtown, didn't really open until 1988. This was a state creation. It followed a failed attempt to create a linear park by the state DNR. And while it is called a state park, it is operated independently from the state park system. It has its own commission, its own legislation and state code. So I don't want to say that it really wasn't about the river, because it was, but a big focus was on downtown destination development, on brownfield redevelopment, on connection to amateur sports, and also consolidation of state government facilities into a downtown campus. And so today that park is home to the NCAA headquarters and museum, the State Museum, the Idle George Museum of Western Art, the Downtown Canal Walk, which you see behind me, trails, a pedestrian bridge, and a brand new outdoor amphitheater stage. And then December 1999 happened. The Guide Corporation, which is an auto-related company that was upstream in Anderson, Indiana, released a series of toxic chemicals into the municipal wastewater system of the city of Anderson, which was not capable of treating them. And so they got dumped raw into the river, led to a complete kill for 30 miles downstream of everything in the river, and a partial kill 20 more miles downstream. So a estimated total of about 4.6 million fish were killed over the course of the next couple of weeks. And so this event really galvanized the environmental community and led to the establishment of several river-focused groups, including the Friends of White River and a more watershed-scale organization called the White River Alliance. Now, the spill, or illegal discharge is what it really was, did lead to a guilty plea to 7 criminal counts and a $14 million settlement. $6 million of that went into river restoration, so more public access points, some land acquisition and restorations. Millions of fish were restocked, including species that had been lost over time. And in many ways, because of this horrible accident or horrible incident, the river is really a lot healthier than before. Now, in 2006, Indianapolis, like many cities, was sued by the EPA under the Clean Water Act for our combined sewer system. which dumps raw sewage into our river and its urban tributaries more than 60 times a year, anytime we get a quarter-inch of rain in the basin or more. It's also important to note that the consent decree actually started as a civil rights complaint in the city. Now, in 2010, we were able to renegotiate that consent decree to not only save money, but also to capture more of that wastewater pollution. And that started the Dig Indy Tunnel System, which is a network of 28 miles of deep rock storage tunnels, which we're digging right now. Costs about $2 billion, and by 2025 is slated to reduce overflows by 97%. Important note, that does not factor in climate change, and that's been in the news quite a bit lately. Now, in 2010, our community foundation hosted the CEOs for Cities Livability Challenge. CEOs for Cities is now known as Forward Cities. But they brought together urbanists to dream about the future of cities, and they came up with 10 big ideas, one of which was reconnect to our waterways. And so our community foundation and some other leaders that were present in that conversation took several of those ideas to heart, including launching a collective impact initiative known as Reconnecting to Our Waterways. And that really began focusing grassroots attention on the White River and 4 of its urban tributaries. Not just the waterway, but how the neighborhoods can take advantage of this increasingly clean water because of the Dig Indy Tunnel System. And so by 2014, waterways were showing up in official city planning documents, including the city's Plan 2020 Comprehensive Planning Initiative that I led back in my days at the city, as well as Visit Indy, where I'm at now, the Regional Tourism Master Plan, which gained some media attention with discussion of a downtown beach on the White River model after what Paris does every year. And so this is a slide that I don't typically show in these presentations, but it's more some of the nuts and bolts as you guys consider a project like this. But in 2017, the city of Indianapolis, which is a consolidated city and county, so we're a 400 square mile city, joined together with Visit Indy and Visit Hamilton County, which is the DMO for the counties of the suburb north of us, really came together to execute a planning process. We developed this 6-pillar scope of services with engagement running throughout, and we jointly issued an RFQ, request for qualifications. We had 9 responses, all but one of which were a mix of national and local talent. And we had a selection team that included the 3 convening partners and some other civic leaders, including some political officials. And we unanimously landed on a lead firm that became known as Agency Landscape and Planning, based out of Boston. They're kind of a derivative of Sasaki, who designed our initial White River State Park system downtown. And so Visit Indy's this is really nitty gritty, but Visit Indy's 501c3 arm served as the fiscal agent while the city of Indianapolis held the contract. And we needed a fiscal agent because those of you in government know that it's incredibly hard to accept money that's not appropriated by your governing body. And so since we didn't necessarily have all the funds at the beginning, we decided that a nonprofit was the easiest place that could accept both philanthropic funds, which also are hard to give to government sometimes, as well as those government funds. All right, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of what is in our plan. And so really, while Indianapolis was ahead of the game in the 70s and 80s when we developed White River State Park, cities across the world, including over in Ohio, have really leapfrogged us in terms of what they're doing with their riverfronts. But we didn't want to just look at what our peers are doing. We really wanted to be inspired about what's happening all around the world. And so Seoul in South Korea tore down an urban freeway that was covering a small and really heavily polluted river and restored it through the heart of the city into an amazing place that has now some of the most attractive real estate. Shanghai is adding a riverfront park and trail system along its Huangpu River in its financial district. Singapore Gardens by the Bay is a nature park along the water that has become the single biggest attraction in Southeast Asia since its opening. And then the Paris Seine River there, you see the beach that they literally truck in sand on the concrete edge every summer, and people love it. And so the White River Vision Plan is a plan for 58 miles of the river in Marion and Hamilton counties. And so there you see Indianapolis and Marion County is that southern county, Hamilton County is to the north there. At the time we did this, it was one of the largest river planning efforts in the nation. Atlanta's done something that's quite a bit larger, and you guys as well. Now the point of distinction really for us from many of those places is that many of our peer cities are largely focused on a signature downtown park. We're talking about that too, but really more importantly, we're talking about a 58-mile experience of destinations, big and small, loud and quiet, developed and wild. So this incredible diversity of experiences. So this is the planning team. Again, it was led by the city and the tourism organizations. We had several citizen committees that were established, a steering committee that really balanced regional interests. Those were the heavy hitters. We had stakeholder committees, which represented more interest groups, as well as some landowners, type entities, attractions, destinations. And then we had 6 technical task forces that were really more, that's where the brains of the input were at. So we did issue the joint RFQ, and then this is the team, the technical team and the engagement team led by Agency Landscape and Planning that was assembled. So it took us a little more than a year and a half or so. We had 3 phases of community conversation, and each of these phases had multiple levels of community engagement in both of our counties. So in Discover, that's it's understanding what's going on right now, what communities and partners have planned to do already. How healthy is the river, things like that. Envision was the exciting phase where we get to think about and dream about what we want the river to be. And then action was last because it's also the really hardest phase, and that's really how do we actually get this done. And so we released the final plan at the beginning of this year, right as the pandemic was getting underway. And I'll talk about what we've been doing since here in a minute. Now, during our planning process, we had 13,000 voices participate in our conversation. We had, as I said, some of our own meetings, but most of our engagement was actually, joining existing events where people were already gathering. It's going to people where they're at. We had conversations over dinner in people's kitchens, as well as in corporate boardrooms downtown. The voices represented rural, suburban, urban, parks and public works departments, anchor destinations, environmentalists, everything in between. And from all of these conversations emerged one vision. The White River is Central Indiana's next frontier, unifying and diverse, productive and protected, timeless and contemporary. Now, the plan is a generational plan to connect thousands of acres of existing and new parks and destinations to create a national park scale system within the heart of our region. It's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to outlive every single political cycle. And so instead of having a 58-mile engineering drawing of exactly what's going to happen every square foot, we organized the plan around 2 really frameworks. The first are guiding principles that you see here, and these really represent the North Star that guides and shapes our decisions in the future. It's kind of like our Constitution. The 9 principles are loosely grouped, as you see here, into 3 categories of environmental protection or enhancement, economy and activation, and then equity. And I'm going to go through the rest of the presentation here is really going to be organized around these themes. Now, the other framework are what we call river reaches or character zones that really celebrate the diversity of landscapes and communities that we do have along the river. Within each of these reaches are anchors or case studies that represent the diversity of places we have. And so for each of those case studies within the reaches, we've done a deep dive in exploring these ideas with the idea that they provide really lessons and guidance for the hundreds, if not thousands, of other important places in between. And so you can kind of think of these 2 frameworks really as a matrix, with each case study illustrating the application of a set of principles and a set of principles vice versa being illustrated in a variety of different case studies. And so getting into the content, getting into these principles, really the first and foundational group of principles relates to environment and ecology. We did factor in, or we did use some climate change studies coming out of Purdue University, factored into our planning efforts. We know that our regional climate is changing, and according to those Purdue scientists, that's going to mean increased highs and lows on the river. Probably the same thing that's going to be on the Great Miami. And we're also expecting increased intense storms and more destructive flooding. So our first principle is really about addressing that changing climate through two really distinct actions. One is managing and storing water on a regional scale before it gets into populated neighborhoods, as well as this idea of a free-flowing river. And so the first part about stormwater, today we have about 6,500 buildings in the floodplain just in our two counties. And we know that flooding is going to only intensify. And so once development happens in these areas, it's incredibly expensive to protect. You have to build and maintain levees and flood walls and pumping stations and all that stuff. And while that may be the only option for places that are already built, we can strengthen, zoning regulations and things like that for new development that happens. And for places that are already built, it's going to be significantly more cost effective to store floodwaters in unpopulated areas than to continue to build levees. And so we can protect upstream rural lands from development, purchase flooding easements from farmers, use existing quarries, and really direct these floodwaters to these areas, kind of like you guys do with your dry dams, instead of trying to protect our neighborhoods downstream. Now, the second piece of that is restoring and adapting of that principle is a free-flowing river. And so today we have 6 low-head dams just in our two counties on the river, and they're all necessary for either water supply or utility purposes. And so we can't just blow them up. As you likely know, low-head dams are incredibly dangerous for people, but they're also very ecologically damaging because of the way they disrupt the river and prevent migration of aquatic species. Now, the good news is that we can retrofit these dams into rock arch ramps, dams, somewhat like you've done in Dayton, but basically a series of cascading rapids that still maintain the upstream pool, but does what's needed in a way that's safer for people and allows fish migration. And so the good news is during our planning process, we had one of our oldest 100-year-old dams collapse that provided the pool for our city's emergency water intake. So that's not good. But the good news is that because of our work and our relationship or integrating the DNR, which regulates this stuff over here, the utility is having to put it back as a rock arch ramp instead of a low-head dam. So the second principle is about preserving, connecting, and actually growing the natural and wild places we have. Really at the bookends, the north and south bookends of our region, we have 2 amazing parks that are actually big enough to have what ecologists refer to as core habitat. So interior forests where you start seeing species that you're not going to find anywhere else. So Strawtown-Katawi Park in northern Hamilton County and Southwestway Park here in Indy are super critical, important ecological places that we want to preserve, connect, if not, like I said, actually expand. And then the final ecological environmental principle really starts connecting humans into the environmental story by exposing them to the full seasonality of the river. The river has many different personalities as you go through the seasons, and the same location can have dramatically different reasons for people to come learn about the river. So those old quarries that we typically turn into lakefront mansions can instead bring entirely new experiences to all of us. I don't know if you guys lament this over there, but over here we often say that we don't have mountains, we don't have oceans, but we've really kind of, with our quarry system, we've really dug kind of inverse mountains, if you want to think about it that way, along the river. And so let's capture these unique landscapes. In the spring, we can flood them when needed for rain. In the summer, they can be performance venues. We've already had a symphony in the quarry happen a few years back. In the fall, they can be ropes courses and zip lines and climbing. And in the winter, they can be naturally frozen for skating and winter recreation. And so what does that look like on the ground? This is one of those case study sites, Southwest Way Park along the river. Also has a next door golf course to it. Parts of it look like this. Indianapolis invests very poorly in our park system. And we do have gyms of parks that don't look like this, but in this case, this is one of those places that's really been loved to death. And you can see this is right on the river. People clearly use it, but we think we can do better. And so this is an idea of taking those principles of using, preserving that core habitat there in the background, doing some native restoration in the foreground, adding amenities for people to understand the importance and value of the river, and then teaching people some of the history of the ecology and landscape of the river. So that's the first group of principles. The next really focused on the people side of things and how we can activate the river and really make it part of the daily quality of life for our residents. And this is under the premise that people really only care about what they experience and what they love. And so if we can get more and more people to care about and love the river itself will get healthy. And so we need to provide different ways for people to love and engage the river. Now, most of the land along our river is not publicly owned. And so we do want to preserve what we have clearly and promote the purchase or the easement of more. But in reality, in many places, the connection of the river will be through the rights of way that cross it. And so these are really the paths that we have the opportunity to pull the river into our neighborhoods and into our commercial districts so that it becomes much more accessible. There's an incredible history, natural, social, all sorts of stories. Times to the different American Indian tribes that were here, to the European settlement and modern day industry. And so we want to make sure that we have a good way to connect those stories and tell those stories. So it's really a 58-mile kind of outdoor museum, if you want to think about it that way. And then there's the big picture. There is the fact that we don't have mountains, we don't have oceans. We landed on Amazon HQ2's finalist list, which shocked many of us. But as we try to attract talent like that, we recognize that we have to think about the big picture and about what does this mean to have a national park-like amenity in the core of our region. And so what does that look like on the ground? Downtown Noblesville. Noblesville is the county seat of the county north of us, Hamilton County. It's probably the next frontier of suburban growth. And it is one of the few river communities that actually has a downtown on the river. The Mayor Disler hated me showing this picture because this was of a bridge under construction, and so it doesn't always look this way. But the point that we're trying to show here is there's always these leftover slivers of real estate left over from county government or parking lots or bridge, or public works projects. And so we're saying that in places like this, it really makes sense to double down on density. We know that there's a demand for waterfront living and waterfront dining and waterfront working. And so rather than take an undisturbed area, let's keep it compact in the villages like Noblesville and Indianapolis and a couple other communities that we have. But let's add new amenities. Let's restore those slopes with some native landscaping, terraces that filter the water, and provide some of these smaller scale performance spaces really for our community. Another place is Keystone at the Crossing. This is our 1%er mall, if you've been to Indy. But it's really a poster child. It's a very suburban area where our two counties come together. It's really a poster child for how we've turned our back on the river. And so if you knew the river flowed through this area, it's only because you've been stuck in traffic on 82nd Street, which is the only street that goes east-west through here. This is where we've put billboards, we put dumpsters, we put employee parking lots on the river, and we see over time flipping that around so that development embraces the water, turning those dumpster areas into restored wetlands and prairies fronted with waterfront dining and shopping and recreational experiences. And apparently we even want to import tropical birds to make this exciting. We're not. And then the final group of things, principles, address equity, and equity is in the broadest sense. We know that Central Indiana will continue to absorb more and more a greater share of the state's growth. And so that's going to put pressure on existing land uses and neighborhoods. And so how do we make sure that our regional work actually addresses some of those concerns rather than exacerbate them, as many previous planning efforts have had? And so historically, the most marginalized in our communities have been pushed to the river's edge because of its hazards. It's, you know, if you can afford not to live in a floodplain, you didn't. And so we know that growing population pressures, coupled with the investments in parks and amenities that make our places more desirable to live, can have negative consequences on some of our most vulnerable residents. We've also heard lessons from Pittsburgh, who lost large swaths of public riverfront access because they were primarily focused on private development, getting that going. And we've also learned from Greenville, North Carolina, who's had to figure out how to build affordable housing after the fact to keep neighbors in their communities after land prices had already begun to skyrocket. And so if there is a bright side for Indy coming to this game late, it's that we can understand that this will happen in our community and get in front of it. And that means really thinking about ancillary issues like affordable housing, like economic opportunity, and like community identity. As I mentioned, there's a variety of land ownership patterns in that 58 miles. Most of it's private. And so there have been, especially in the northern reaches, there have been families that have owned that farm the same land almost since Indiana became a state. So we want to honor and respect that heritage and find ways that we can kind of navigate through that. And so there will be places where there will be a public trail or public access. There'll be places where we can acquire easements for some things. And there will also be places we have to understand that really the bridges that connect both sides of the river are really the only place people might have to experience the river. And so we have to think about especially our bridges in a very kind of sensitive way. And then the hard part, Indianapolis and Marion County and Hamilton County could not be more different. Is party, race, income, you know, every possible divide occurs in our community. And so it's rare that we come together to do planning efforts like this beyond the the required MPO transportation planning stuff. And so this is really one of the first regional efforts we've had, and it has not always been easy, and it does not always continue to be easy. But we really want to figure out a way to keep this cooperation going. We do not have a lot of built-in ways in state code to enable regional type government, and I'll come back to that here in a second because that's where we're at right now. And so those principles of equity, how do they play out on the ground? And so this is downtown Indianapolis, and this extends further. On the southern edge of this map, you have a former GM automotive plant, the GM stamping plant, that has been, that's now in a redevelopment mode for kind of a brand new downtown neighborhood. Then you have White River State Park, and then upstream you have that large piece of green is known as Riverside Park. It's actually a park that's bigger than Manhattan Central Park. And it's pretty exciting, some stuff that we're working on there. But in the middle, this is that dam that I mentioned that collapsed. So this was a low-head dam that was built in the 1890s that provided our emergency water intake supply, and it fell down. And so this is the one that's going to be rebuilt by the utility as a rock arch ramp. It's also the site historically of an African-American beach. And so in the 1920s, like many places, our parks and our public swimming pools were segregated. And so our Black neighbors were not able to take advantage of those recreational opportunities. There was actually a group of Black entrepreneurs that attempted to purchase what is now kind of a family center community park. They attempted to purchase that upstream on the river to basically create a Black country club at the time The park board said that if that were to happen, that they would use eminent domain to seize it because they didn't want our Black residents to have that sort of amenity. And so the only place that they were allowed to swim is south of this dam because it was the most polluted. I mentioned all the industry that was along the river here. There was literally carcasses from the slaughterhouses that were dumped into the river. And so the power structure at the time, the white power structure, really didn't care about this part of the river. And so that's why they really didn't care that Black residents used the impromptu gravelly sands here to what became known as Belmont Beach. So we want to honor that story. We want to bring that back. That's largely been lost to history, including to the neighborhoods right next door. And so we want to celebrate, not celebrate the fact that it happened, but we want to make sure it's kind of a reminder of things that have happened and how, really despite what humans have thrown at the river, despite what humans have thrown at one another, they're both still here, they're both still thriving, they're both resilient. And so we really want to celebrate that connection of humanity, resilience, and the water. And so it's going to be a long time before an image like this can happen, because even after the CSO tunnels are complete, we have water quality challenges, primarily from agriculture upstream, as well as stormwater runoff from urban areas. But this idea of how do we replace that dam as that rapid series, and then how do we celebrate in a very sensitive way that story. And so that leads me to really quick, what's next. This is a butterfly trail that's been built in the floodplain inside the levees downtown. There's momentum building. The good news is that the White River is beginning to be baked into the planning and work of dozens of destinations, dozens of partners. The cool thing is that we have Conner Prairie, which is a living history museum on the river. We have the Indianapolis Art Center on the river. We have a series of obviously magnificent city parks. We have the Indianapolis Art Center, now known as Newfields, which is a huge outdoor campus on the river. We have White River State Park downtown. And so there's a lot of amenities already together on the river. And so this is just a list of some of the things or entities and places that are using the river, now embracing the river. And so just to highlight a few examples, the Taggart Memorial is a crumbling memorial to a former mayor that's being saved and repurposed into a state-of-the-art outdoor amphitheater and home to our Shakespeare company, Indy Shakes, and that's in that Riverside Park that I mentioned. Conner Prairie upstream is, I said, a living history campus, and they actually have 4 miles of riverbank under their control. And that riverbank and that river is actually featured front and center in a new master plan that they have, which includes a river ecology center and plans to actually get kids and families on the river. The water's a lot cleaner up in their area. Hamilton County Parks is expanding Potter's Bridge Park, which contains the only historic covered bridge in our area. And that will also include a 40-acre lake, kind of quarry conversion that will help us with flood storage. And then Riverside Park downtown has a new master plan that converts 2 of its 3 18-hole golf courses into other public uses. And plans are underway right now, actually, to develop an outdoor adventure and ecology park on one of them. And then finally, there's the Indianapolis/Phoenix philanthropic organization known as the Nina Mason Pulliam Charitable Trust. Those are the 2 cities that she lived in. That continues to invest millions of dollars in a second phase of its Partners for the White River program, which is one of those things that helped fund our effort. And there's one thing that we have underway besides governance right now, and that is this idea of brand and communication. And so if the metaphor is we're trying to build a national park, how does that actually play out on the ground? And so if Conner Prairie upstream is Old Faithful, if Newfields or Art Museum is Mud Volcano, Southwestway Park downstream is Mammoth Hot Springs, what is that Yellowstone package that ties it all together? And then as some of you mentioned in the chat, how do you get places with their own brands, their own diverse missions and own identities to latch on and to be part of that, to understand that they are Old Faithful does have its own brand, but it's within Yellowstone. And so how you sensitively work through that. And so we actually have a second grant from the Nina Mason Pulliam Trust to start engaging our attractions, our neighbors, to figure that out. And then the final part of my presentation, and we'll open up for questions, is really on governance. And what do I mean by governance? It's how do we come together to make decisions? And so we know we want to implement the White River Vision Plan, but how do we do that? How do we engage the public? Who gets to decide? Who gets to vote? How do we fund all this in a region that is very tax averse? How do we actually get programs done? Do we do them as an entity? Do we have other partners do them? All those sorts of things we're wrestling with. And so during the planning process, we had HR&A advisors out of New York City who think about this project like this all over the world help us. And so through this process, they identify the types of activities that are needed to implement our plan, the qualities of an entity that are needed. We did look at national best practices, of which you guys were one of them. And then we developed kind of initial conceptual recommendation. And so when we think about the types of activities that we want to do, the first is coordination. I mentioned that we don't have regional scale really government in Indiana. And so how do we continue to do this together? How do we coordinate? How do we market? How do we advocate? Things like that. And clearly there's implementation support and funding is in that. Does that mean a dedicated tax revenue? Does that mean concession revenue? Does that mean contributions and donations? And once we actually have funding, how do we get projects aligned, funded, approved, built? And then last but not least, something that I don't know if you guys struggle with, but we certainly struggle with here in Indianapolis, is how do we actually take care of stuff that we've built? And so how do we maintain it? How do we program it, activate it, and make the most out of it? And so whatever governance structure we come up with has to do these things. And so just a word about funding. We looked at different types of funding and different types of entities, whether they're government or nonprofit or private sector, have access to different types of these sources. So that has factored into our conversations. And then finally, they looked at kind of the criteria of what this entity has to be to be effective. And so it does have to be effective. It has to be able to implement the full mission and deliver on all of the required activities, but also has to be flexible so that it can evolve. And this is a generational endeavor, and things are likely to change. An obvious one is that the river is longer than our two counties. And so how can it grow upstream and downstream as those communities begin to embrace the river themselves? The economics have to work. We have to be able to bring in and spend money from various sources, not only for big capital projects, but also to cover our own overhead needed to keep us going. Clearly, it has to be politically possible, and that's more than just the obvious big P politics in government. It also means being accountable to the public that crafted this vision, has to add value, not compete with our existing partners. The last thing we really want to do is diminish the support and work that our existing partners are doing. So we have to find ways that don't detract from them and actually support them. And then finally, it has to be practical. The ideal model doesn't help us if it's virtually impossible to get going. And perhaps the best we can do is to get close to all of this. Perhaps it's incremental, but we know that it also has to be politically possible. And we happen to be going to the State House next year, probably in the most difficult session that all state governments in the United States are having because of the pandemic budget implications. And so, like I said, the good news is that we're not ahead of the curve here. There are rivers and regions and other places that we can learn from. And so we have explored a variety of models that range from simple kind of MOAs between jurisdictions. That is the model that Los Angeles River has used. all the way down to more structured entities like the Ohio Conservancy District, like the Metro Park System that you guys have that we do not have. And then the Boston Islands Partnership, which is a federal state nonprofit model. And so at the end of the planning process, we realized that there was not a perfect fit in state code. We do not have the tools. We do have a conservancy district model in state code, but it's very different from what you all have. It's very landowner driven or landowner governed. And so what was recommended is that we form a transition team, kind of a trust that keeps this the egg that we had hatched with a vision plan to keep it incubated before self-interest starts taking over. And so that's what we did. The initial recommendation from the plan was that there'd be some marriage of a coordinating nonprofit that helps with fundraising and programming and things like that with a regional governmental entity that had a little more teeth and mandate. And so over the summer, each county appointed 5 residents of their communities to the transition team to explore that model. Important to note was that only a couple of them were actually involved in the planning process. We wanted to have some new voices, and we were looking for people with different expertise than the planning process. And so these are people that had expertise in building organizations and funding projects, political and community connections, that were important to understand what we can actually get done in our reality. And so we obviously fed them the plan and all the technical reports that went with it, but we also brought in expert local stakeholders around those guiding principle buckets, so around environment, economy, and equity, to share their thoughts. And those were really unfiltered conversations with the transition team. And so we are still hammering this out. I will say we landed, to kind of give you some insider info, we did land on kind of 3, I guess, pillars of what we come up with has to do. And so we know that we have to have state and local at the table. And that is the one thing that there's not a model in state code for. It's either state controlled or it's local controlled. There's really nothing that forces them together. And so what we're doing is looking at authorizing a new locally controlled entity within an existing governor controlled entity and having really a fiscal relationship between those two. The state controls the river. The state, not owns, but manages the river for the public trust. But we want local communities to have a say and a voice in actually what happens. And so we're trying to figure out a way to marriage those together. I mentioned that we are a tax averse state, and so we do not fund government of any sort adequately. We do not fund our environmental needs adequately. And so we know that we have to have new revenue somehow. We don't want to take revenue away from any one nonprofit or government that's doing things right now. If anything, we want to add to that. If we're going to take revenue away, we start becoming politically impossible, and we start kind of shooting ourselves in our own foot because we need those partners to do their good work. And then finally, there has to be continued to be a big tent. People often ask, why is Visit Indy and Visit Hamilton County involved in this? And that actually creates a lot of suspicion because we're viewed as only caring about outsiders coming in, not caring about our residents. So we're trying to redefine that perception. But the thing that we are able to bring is we're able to bring the bigger picture, the storytelling about the importance of this for the future of our region. And so the more focused we get on environment or water supply or recreation or tourism, we really start losing people. And so we want as many people to have as many reasons to care about the river as needed. That's how we're going to get political support to actually get this done. It's not just about environment and supply and recreation and tourism. It's about all of those things and more. And so we want to make sure that this is not perceived as just an entity for one of those purposes or the other. And so that's the end of my spiel. It's really quick. I can probably get you guys the slides if you guys want. But otherwise, mywhiteriver.com is the location, is our website, and you can actually download the final plan. You can download the technical reports. you can actually see the recordings of the transition team meetings where we interviewed some of the local stakeholders. And so you can see all that information there. This is me standing in front of a bridge that we just installed some pretty cool LED lighting on, super basic investment, but just a start of what's to come for our river. And so mywhiteriver.com, you can also email me, brad@mywhiteriver.com. And with that, I'll turn off my screen share and be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Brad. We have several questions in the Q&A, and everyone, if you could remember to put your questions in the Q&A so that we can all kind of vote. You can vote on those to move them up. But I will read this out. Dan asks, when you talk about equity and the need for more affordable housing on the river, can you tell us more about who is involved in those discussions and what kind of strategies are you using to promote more quality affordable housing specifically? I know that's definitely a topic in our communities, and when our communities have done some of their riverfront master plans or their downtown master plans, this has come up several times.
Yeah, and this is a difficult one. Traditionally, so who's involved have been our political leaders, our affordable housing advocates, our community development corporations, which are largely the vehicle by which Indianapolis builds affordable housing. And so there have been, the only way Indianapolis has to date to preserve affordable housing is through federal subsidies. And there's a little bit of local subsidy, but it's through CDBG, it's through HOME, it's the typical affordable housing programs that we all deploy. The thing about those is they have burn off periods, right? And so you lose the affordability after 10 or 15 years, tax credits. And then, if that neighborhood has gentrified, which often happened, then you've kind of lose that affordable housing stock. And so there's a couple programs that have been happening parallel. One is a land trust conversation that we're looking to deploy in a couple neighborhoods, but a couple actually along the river. That actually kind of split the land ownership and the building ownership, so you can preserve affordability permanently, long term. The other is state legislation, and so we have property tax caps in Indiana. Long story about how they got there, but we had a Tea Party before the Tea Party was a national thing, and so the challenge. The challenge that we're having is everyone is maxed at the tax caps. The only way to grow your tax base is to attract income, so higher income, and so you end up with this perverse public policy of doing things that make it your communities, your neighborhoods attractive for rich people to move into, because that's the only way to grow your budget. We also have state preemption of inclusive zoning, and so we cannot factor in income and things as far as our approval processes. The only way that we can influence affordability really is through negotiation. And so we have to put money into the thing. And so we have started using some of our tax increment financing investments, our developer-backed bond investments. When developers are requesting those, we negotiate it in some public benefit. And oftentimes that's either workforce housing, which is at 80% of median income, or lower income, which gets below that. And that sometimes is a burn-off period, sometimes that's permanent. And the other thing is going to the state to say, can we implement some sort of like New York City rent control, where your rent is based on when you moved in, or can your property taxes be based on when you move in, so that you don't have the case of we have a long-term homeowner on disability on Social Security and a low income, lived in a neighborhood but gets priced out because they can't afford the escalating taxes because of tax increases. And so we have been working with the state house on that. That's quite an urban issue. Our state house is not, is a rural dominated legislature. And so that has not gotten the traction that we want, but we continue to work on that piece.
Thank you. And if you have any clarifying question about that, type that into the Q&A. Jacob from the City of Hamilton asks, are there any tips for helping identify creative funding sources to support river-based capital projects? He specifically gives the example of like modifications to some of our infrastructure, like those low dams. But I know that some of our riverfront communities have also been trying to find funding to do those recreation enhancements, those develop those parks that they have these great master plans for. So, we're always just for more creative funding sources.
Bring back earmarks. I think that's the easy one. But absent that, the one that we are converting is utility owned, and so that is that the cost of that is being passed on to the ratepayers. And so if you've got a utility in play and you've got a state utility regulatory commission, it's getting them to understand the value of this of that type of conversion. We have found the public safety piece has resonated more with people than the environmental piece. So the fact that you have people dying because they get trapped in the vortex beneath them might tap into some creative public safety type buckets. Really, the idea of value capture is kind of where we're landed. The idea that if you convert these, someone benefits. And is there a way to not extract, that's a bad word, but is there a way to capture some of that increased economic benefit to actually do the project? And so the easiest example of that is tax increment financing. We do have a series of TIFs in Indianapolis along the river. And Indianapolis has this weird state in our state TIF law that allows us to convey TIF money along water. It's more complicated than that, but it's conveyance, and so we can move. So even if the dams are not in a TIF area, we can use TIF money to do them. Now those TIFs typically are tapped for other purposes, and so that's not easy. I don't know, that's not necessarily creative, but those are really the only ways that we have found right now. Now we do have, completely separate from this process, the state legislature conducts study committees every summer for issues that they're not ready to tackle, but they want to learn more about. And one of those is a statewide Lowhead Dam study committee to understand what our problem is, what their condition is, and ultimately what it's going to take to address them. And so that's a huge opportunity for us.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's a question that we've probably asked every single one of the cities or organizations that has been presented at Summit. We're always looking to share ideas and see how other people are pulling it off so that we can, find those funds that we're all looking for. So I don't want to, we are getting up to the top of the hour. I don't want us to go over. I do want to thank you so much. I think we've sort of missed an opportunity now, but we'll take it in the future, which is we were planning to charter a bus and invite all of you to take a trip to Indy with us and visit these places in person. And we were going to announce that at the April Summit. And unfortunately, we will do that again in the future. And I know you'd like to bring some of your stakeholders over and visit our amenities. We'd love to have you. And that is something that we do when Summit speakers come, is to give you a little tour. So we still owe you that, and we'll definitely make sure that our cities get to show off all the best that our counties and our parks have to offer. So thank you again so much. I do think the one last question will leave us with, we've seen a tremendous increase in our parks and our trails and the river itself as the last few months. And I just, have you been tracking that at all? Do you know what the percentage is, or, what kind of increase have you seen?
So we have not done that yet. There are platforms that retail uses and that tourism uses that really track cell phones. And so we have started to geofence some of our major parks, and actually Hamilton County has geofenced the entire river. And so they are now able to tell, honestly, week by week, who's using the river. So the zip code that phone typically lives in, if it's a resident, if it's a visitor, how long they're there. And so that is something that Visit Indy is starting to bake into our research kind of program, so we can understand that. And the cool thing about that data is
Uber.
there's a company called Uber Media, unrelated to Uber, the app.
Uber.
The cool thing about them is they have data going back to like 2015, and so you could buy data from before pandemic and pandemic, during the summer, and compare, who's using your riverfront. It's not necessarily cheap. It's not necessarily easy to digest. But that is something that we are baking into our research platform. And some of that is to demonstrate to our political officials that we invest millions and millions of dollars in our stadiums downtown. But actually, if you look at who's benefiting from that and who's benefiting from our investments in our parks, you might, make different considerations in the future. And so that is something that's important for us to demonstrate the value of what we're doing.
Oh, that's a great little tip. So that alone gets me excited about how we can track our users and how we can better understand where they're going and how they're using it. So, gosh, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Brad. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Just the last little bits of housekeeping. Thanks again to our sponsors. We couldn't do this without them. Thanks to the City of Hamilton for pivoting and having us go virtual. Thanks to the Fitness Center, which is where we will be next April 30th for the summit. But thanks to them for letting us reschedule several times. Just wanted to make sure we go on record of everyone has been so flexible and so kind during this time. So that is all we have for today, unless someone raises their hand and lets me know I've forgotten something. Please register for that October 27th series or event that we will kick off this Riverway Conversation series. We'll be sending out the link via our newsletter on Monday. And someone's telling me I forgot something. Oh, no, good. They're just thanking Brad. And also make sure that you put that April 30th, 2021 on your calendar, because we'll see you in person then. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy your weekend, and we will see you soon.
Good weekend, everyone. Thanks for having me.